Hello everybody, I'm Kelly Ellis and I'll be the moderator today for our session. Welcome to the webinar, our penultimate exploration of young people and anxiety, and thanks for joining me for this great topic today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Associate Professor Ben Harrison. Ben will talk about neuroscience and anxiety, our final anxiety talk in this series. He's a Principal Research Fellow with the Melbourne Neuropsychiatry Centre and Department of Psychiatry at the University of Melbourne. He leads the Depression and Anxiety Neuroscience team at Melbourne Neuropsychiatry Centre. His background is in psychology and neuroscience, and his research uses neuroimaging techniques, particularly fMRI. Ben is interested in how the brain supports emotion, affect, and other self-related processes, with particular relevance to mood and anxiety disorders. He completed his PhD at Swinburne University of Technology in 2006, and since then has obtained a number of fellowships and project grants. So I'll now introduce Ben and he will start the session.
Okay, thanks very much for the introduction, Kelly. And it's great to be here to give you this webinar today on the neuroscience of fear and anxiety with relevance to anxiety disorders. I've really tried to pitch this talk, to a broad audience. So I'm assuming that you don't have a background in neuroscience. I really want to keep the jargon light so you can engage with some of the ideas and the concepts. And I'm very happy to take a variety of questions at the end. Okay, let me move to the first slide. So I've structured the webinar, essentially into three parts. The first part, which is probably the largest part of the webinar, I'm going to devote to talking about what we can call a two-system model of fear and anxiety, if you like. This is kind of a recent way of thinking about how fear and anxiety may be supported and represented in the brain. It really makes the distinction between the consideration of defense survival circuits, we'll call them, versus brain circuits that are more associated with the conscious experience of emotions. And this model has been introduced, as I said, quite recently as a way to kind of, force the separation of these ideas, which have probably been a little bit blurred and confused, perhaps for the last couple of decades in this area. I'm then going to review some of the evidence in anxiety disorders with a particular focus on neuroimaging research, which happens to be, as Kelly said, my own area of interest. So with functional magnetic resonance imaging, which I'll overview for you. And I'm then going to talk about a few other issues around this topic, in particular, what is the role of adolescent brain development in relation to the development of anxiety disorders, which is very, very common during this period of life, and then also some consideration of how neuroscience might improve our understanding and treatment of anxiety disorders with time. So I think it's important to first start by having a clear kind of understanding of what these terms mean. There really isn't kind of any universally agreed kind of description of these terms, because this phenomenon, fear and anxiety, cut across quite a few domains. If you think about the physiological aspects of fear and anxiety, the behavioral aspects in terms of avoidance and escape behaviors, and then also the subjective components of fear and anxiety, that is how they feel to you when you experience them. But it's been recently kind of argued quite emphatically that we should focus on the latter in terms of thinking about these terms, because it's almost impossible not to invoke these ideas of the conscious feelings of fear and anxiety when we talk about these terms. So we should really stick to this maybe. And then also clinically, I think, of course, the diagnosis and treatment of anxiety disorders is very much on the basis, almost exclusively made on the basis of dialogue with people about how they feel about their symptoms. So, so I think focusing on the subjective characterization is important. And if we do this, then I think we would describe or define fear as the feelings that occur when a threat being a source of harm, is immediate or imminent. And anxiety, we make the distinction that it's probably feelings that occur when a threat is uncertain or anticipated. So it's more of a future-oriented subjective state. And we can, can demonstrate this here. This distinction with these cartoons. On the left, imagine you're sitting in your lounge room and a tiger walks in. You're going to experience fear. There's a clear and present danger. Not that that's ever going to happen, but it's an easy way to characterize what fear is. It's that kind of fast, immediate, reaction to a threat. Whereas if you're sitting there worried about or thinking about what if a tiger, walks into my lounge room, again, it's not going to happen. But we can think about that as a way to think about anxiety. There's a perceived threat and a danger, but it's not actually there. Okay, and of course the boundary between these constructs is quite grey as well. But for all intents and purposes, we'll think about them like that. Okay, so in thinking about how fear and anxiety are represented in the brain, I'm going to just describe now what's really been the classical view, up to now, which is that the subjective experience of fear and anxiety is very much closely related to or programmed within subcortical parts of the brain that control defensive responses to threats. In other words, fear and anxiety really are innate functions of evolutionary conserved brain circuits, that exist across a whole bunch of organisms, including humans. And this cartoon kind of captures, the essence of this argument. And what you can see here is someone walking, in the cartoon, walking through a forest, comes upon a snake. There's that very fast visual perceptual processing of the threat via a couple of pathways, but that center really or converge on a deep structural part of the brain called the amygdala, which, as I'll explain, is definitely involved in mediating those classical fight or flight responses to a threat. Or the stress hormone response, that kind of quick reaction, the bodily reaction to dealing with a threat. And this is part of the classical view. Okay, so we can kind of we can demonstrate this in another way. The classical view really is that threats induce a state of fear by activating amygdala circuitry. That is, it is causal to the experience of fear, which in turn mediates behavioral and physiological responses. So within this kind of view, the amygdala, as I said, is really causally involved in producing the subjective experience of fear. And this is kind of, this view is absolutely centers on the amygdala as the brain's fear center. This is quite a commonly held view. And why is that? We'll get into that. But just so you know what I'm talking about in terms of anatomy, this is imagine we're looking at the side view of a brain. So I've got one here, I'll show you. This is the side view. Imagine like this. And this image here has been sort of made transparent. The amygdala is sitting very deep, in the temporal, in the medial temporal part of the brain. It's called the amygdala because of its shape and derived from the Latin word for an almond. But this is probably not actually that accurate, because we know now that the amygdala as a structure has, is quite more expansive and extensive than what's depicted there. Here's just a bit more anatomy for you about it. Again, on the top left-hand image, you can see this is a 3D reconstruction of an MRI image. And below that, you can see the vertical line running down on the top left-hand side. Below that would be the corresponding front view, and you can see the amygdala outlined in red, sitting very deep, as I said, in the medial temporal lobe. Top right-hand corner is essentially the same view of that, but that's a post-mortem slice that's been prepared. And then within the insert, if we drop down, you can get an idea of the sort of structure of the amygdala in terms of its major sets of nuclei. But let's not forget, even though it is small, we're talking about 12 million neurons here. So it's a small but very complex structure. Now, the idea that the amygdala is causal to fear has it's come from a variety of sources, but probably a really compelling piece of evidence have been these case studies where people and patients like patient HM, who's been a really well-studied case through a rare genetic disorder, has had almost complete bilateral destruction of the amygdala. It's a very specific kind of lesion to this structure, and she's been studied in many different occasions. You can see these reports in many different publications, and she's been described as the woman with no fear. There's no amygdala, and apparently she experiences no fear. I've taken some extracts from one paper a few years ago. The top right hand slide, you can see this is when she was asked. These are the results of her being asked. She had a hand, I think the idea was she had a computer device that she carried around at home that the researchers gave her, and for 3 months she was probed multiple times a day to kind of rate how she felt across a whole lot of adjectives describing her emotions and mood. And if you look at the right hand part of that plot, you can see that basically she doesn't respond to these adjectives that would describe feelings of fear. Below that are the results of her being presented with a bunch of different movie clips, designed to target different emotions, including fear, and she just again doesn't seem to respond to these fear-inducing clips, but other emotions, yes. And so this has led researchers like this group to say, to conclude that the amygdala's role in the induction and experience of emotion is very specific to fear, and that without the amygdala, the evolutionary value of fear is lost. And these are quite strong ideas. But I would say that the strongest body of evidence sort of linking these ideas has come from fear conditioning studies. So what is that? This slide kind of demonstrates classic or now infamous experiment really that was done back in the 20s with little baby Albert, and this is all set around this idea of Pavlovian classical conditioning. And so what they did was they introduced a white rat or rabbit, I think it was, to baby Albert, and as he was playing with it, one of the investigators made a very loud noise that gave him a tremendous shock. He then paired these associations together. He learnt that over time, they did it multiple times, that when he saw that rat or mouse that that was associated with an aversive outcome, and he was in other words, he was conditioned, fear conditioned to this to this animal, and that I think they showed translated to other white sort of furry objects, which so his fear generalized beyond the animal to other objects. This is just a demonstration of human fear conditioning. Happens very quickly. It's very robust, and I'm sure you've all experienced fear conditioning to some extent, as I have. This is really has been a tremendous area of basic research. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of studies of fear conditioning, over the last 30 years. And what I'm showing on the top of this slide again is this sort of same principle. You can imagine a mouse in an experimental context, and he would respond with fear to an electric shock in this case. If that was paired with an otherwise neutral stimulus, here I'm just a light, that pairing over a couple of times he would evoke that fear response to the light on its own. In other words, it becomes a conditioned stimulus. And fear conditioning experiments have really evolved across a number of different, in a number of ways and in a number of different contexts. And so what I'm showing on the bottom is just some of the different things that are looked at in these types of experiments. So the top, again, go back to the top, the mouse there, learning the associations, that's what we would call acquisition of fear. Another thing that's really, dynamic that's really interesting and become more interesting to look at, especially in the context of anxiety disorders, is fear extinction. So if that conditioned stimulus is presented multiple times with no aversive reinforcement, then the animal can learn that this stimulus is now safe. It's sort of a new form of learning, and that's called fear extinction. And we'll come back to the relevance of fear extinction to anxiety disorders and their treatment. Typically, these studies would also look at how well this new safety learning, if you like, is retained over time, and in terms of how well it can be recalled if the person faces that original sort of context again. And there are other types of variations of these paradigms that look at how the fear may spontaneously recover over time. So it is a big area of research, and still a very active area of research. And through this research, researchers really have characterized in a lot of detail the neurocircuitry of the amygdala, the extended neurocircuitry of the amygdala, and how all the inputs and outputs of this structure in terms of its role in fear learning or emotional learning. And from that, we would definitely conclude that this region is an important and critical interface between sensory systems that process the external world and brain systems, other brain systems that mediate emotional responses and experience. Now, from all this work in animals, there's been a great interest to kind of translate what we've learned to studies in humans, of course, and obviously people have focused on the amygdala as a key structure, as I've said, and trying to understand how the structure interacts with other parts of the brain to kind of map out this extended circuitry in more detail. And neuroimaging human neuroimaging has really been, I would say, the technique of choice for doing this. And so I think it's important that we review some of this work now. So I'll describe to you a little bit about what neuroimaging does, what functional imaging actually does. In the top left-hand corner, you can see an image of an MRI machine. Many of you would probably be familiar with it, have had an MRI for various reasons. But in research studies, what we do is have people go into the MRI machine and generally perform an experiment over a given period of time, let's say 15, 20 minutes. And what we're able to do here is measure changes in brain activity, discrete changes in brain activity over time. And fMRI really just is a variant of the MRI technique. So it is a really powerful technique for studying brain activity. So what I've shown on the top right-hand corner of this slide is an example of how a task might look. And in this case, a fear conditioning task. This is actually a task that we've used in some of our own research. And what you can see at the top part of that image is two coloured spheres, sort of alternating different presentations. We would do this over, say, 15 minutes. And in this case, the yellow sphere is being paired with an aversive stimulus. We normally use something like a loud noise burst, as an aversive stimulus. Now we do that, as I said, over time, and then we're able to contrast or compare changes in brain activity to the stimulus that's been conditioned versus the blue stimulus in this case, which hasn't. So it's important to understand that fMRI really measures relative changes in brain activity, increases in response to something versus something else. And we need to average, many repetitions of these trials across over time across people, because it's quite a noisy signal. And then in doing that, we put everybody's, group of people's results together and we average them statistically, and we're able to produce, these sort of classical brain activation maps, or blob maps as they're often called. So that's a bit of a crash course of fMRI. Now, the first fMRI studies of fear conditioning obviously went straight after the amygdala, and to what extent do we get some reliable and interesting results here? And they did, but then with some caveats. This is back in the late 90s, the two studies that appeared more or less at the same time. But what they really characterised is that amygdala responses in this sort of experimental situation decreased very quickly. They were there and then they were sort of gone. And that led, in one of the papers, the researchers to state that, with time, learned fear representations are expressed in other cortical regions other than medial temporal lobe structures. So there's some confirmation of this amygdala hypothesis, but not entirely, or perhaps not entirely as people thought it might be. There have obviously been many studies since then. That was almost 20 years ago, which actually led us to perform a meta-analysis of this research recently. So that is really an analysis focused on summarising the most consistent findings from all of these studies. And in our case, we're able to put together 27 independent studies. There are around 700 people involved across these experiments. But these experiments were all quite similar of a nature, not exactly the same, but similar enough for us to be able to summarise their results. And in a nutshell, we weren't able to reproduce that or confirm that there is a reliable amygdala involvement in these types of fear conditioning experiments with imaging. Actually, one of the reviewers of this manuscript kind of stated quite emphatically that the authors would do the community a great favour if they finally put away the amygdala-centric view of human fear conditioning and emphasise the role of other, mainly cortical, higher cortical structures that are observed more consistently. So it's quite interesting feedback. And I think it probably is part of a building or mounting case, that sort of highlights some of the problems with this classical view. And there are other sort of lines of evidence that would suggest that we need to sort of expand our thinking about fear and anxiety in the brain. And these are just a couple of points here. One is that subjective reports of fear and anxiety don't really correlate very well with other measures like behavioural and physiological, for example, autonomic changes of fear and anxiety, or amygdala activity for that matter. People with amygdala damage, even that patient HM, has been shown to experience fear and anxiety in other contexts. For example, you can induce panic attacks in patient SM, suggesting that fear can be induced through certain modalities or certain methods. Amygdala activity can be dissociated from the feeling of fear. If we do experiments where there's subliminal or unconscious or non-conscious presentations of threat stimuli, people are unaware or able to feel fear in that sense, but there is still, amygdala still responds. So some dissociation between these ideas. And then I would also argue that imaging studies have more consistently linked subjective experience of fear and anxiety, subjective reports of fear and anxiety to other brain areas, which I'm going to highlight for you. So this is all, sort of been recognised at this point, and it's quite an interesting time to be thinking about, these questions. I'm just showing here. I'm going to show here Joseph Ledoux is probably seen as, one of the pioneers of fear conditioning research and the role of the amygdala in mediating defensive behaviours, etc. And that was very much the early part of his career. It's interesting now he's spending most of his time kind of encouraging everybody to step away a little bit or rethink about this view. Published a lot of papers recently in the last couple of years, as well as a book that I would encourage you to read. It's a really tremendous read. And here's some statements that have come out of some of that work, that I think are important. While amygdala circuits are directly responsible for behavioural and physiological responses to threats, they are not directly responsible for feelings of fear. The idea that the amygdala is the brain's fear centre wrongly assumes that feelings of fear and the responses elicited by threats are produced by the same brain system. And so here's really proposed that we think about, we adopt a two systems view of fear and anxiety in terms of the brain, and that threats really are processed in parallel by subcortical systems, including amygdala circuits, and also cortical circuits. And while in many instances the former influences the latter, it's not always the case. And his view really is, I guess, aligned with what we call modern constructionist view of emotion, where emotions like fear are kind of compiled at a cognitive level out of a lot of different sources, which includes, of course, survival circuit activity, but also other sources of information that from our own body, the environment, from memory. But that, the point is that we see emotions really as higher order mental states, not so much innate functions of sort of old brain circuits, primitive brain circuits. And so how does this happen? Well, in his work, he's arguing that we should think about them or call them cortical consciousness networks or general networks of cognition, which is shown on the left slide there. So very much, I'm going to lift up my brain model, very much talking about the lateral cortical surface of the frontal lobes, the medial surface as being very important to the construction of emotions. On the right-hand side, you can see another sort of depiction of this idea. This is some work from another group that like to refer to this as, well, their idea is that of an effective reference space, if you like, or an effective workspace. In other words, a consistent set of structures that are the activity of these structures would give rise to the emotions at a cortical level. Now we absolutely see results that are consistent with this view, in some of our own work. And what I'm showing you on the left is actually the results of the meta-analysis that I mentioned before of fear conditioning studies. And what these studies really do, I think, in the human context, is create a state of anticipatory anxiety. That's the way that we kind of we model brain responses to these tasks. They're capturing a person's anticipation of receiving an aversive stimulus. But what we see is a pattern of results that is very consistent with this effective workspace view, if you like. But I also think that the results align quite strongly with more classical characterizations of the brain's central autonomic network. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about this. I think these results are really interesting. So what I'm showing on this slide on the far left, again, is the results of this fear conditioning analysis I told you about. In the middle is also another meta-analysis, but this one focused just on the link between brain activity changes and changes in autonomic state. What I'm talking about here is, for example, changes in heart rate or skin conductance as a measure of arousal. So the studies included in this analysis were really mapping directly brain activity to physiological arousal. And you can see the similarity between the two. And then on the right-hand side is the results of a pretty classical study now of what's called interoceptive awareness. In this study, people were either paying attention to their own heartbeats while they were being scanned, but in another condition they were paying attention to an external stimulus. But across these, I think what we're seeing is a pattern of results that is linking certain parts of the brain to the subjective experience of anxiety, particularly related to the body's autonomic state. So this has inspired some work by our group to kind of dig into this a little bit more. And for one study, which we finished a couple of years ago, we focused on this concept or construct of anxiety sensitivity. What is anxiety sensitivity? It's been often described as the fear of fear. It's essentially like an anxiety trait measurement that characterizes the degree to which a person is afraid of bodily anxiety sensations. So it's very characteristic of panic disorder, but anxiety disorders more broadly. So in other words, to what extent that interoceptive sensations, bodily anxiety sensations, are seen as threatening. So we did this study that tries to link together this construct with an experiment designed to provoke anxiety in the scanner, and we found that this particular region of the brain, which I'll use my model again because it's a bit hard to see there, but it's called the anterior cingulate cortex, which sort of sits sort of deep in the medial frontal part of the brain, was very much centrally involved in mediating this appraisal style. So this is a really interesting, perhaps preclinical model of what might happen in panic disorder to some extent. Another aspect of our work has focused on the distinction between not only processing of threats, but also the processing of safety. And if we look at imaging studies and we summarize them, we not only see this response of this central autonomic system that I've described, but also there's a very consistent response that we see when we compare safety to threat. And what I'm showing in the bottom left-hand part of this slide is the results that emerge. It's a different set of brain areas that seem to process safety versus threat. On the right-hand side is essentially the same thing shown, but as characterized across a few different experimental contexts, including fear extinction, fear reversal, and also reappraisal, which I might come back to a bit later. But the point is that these brain systems really seem, in an opposing way, seem to track the processing of threats relative to safety, okay? So we've tried to dig into this a little bit more. We've actually just recently finished and published an experiment that tried to confirm these ideas in a bit more detail. And we did confirm really that this part of the brain, which is called, which would be located here on my model, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is very selectively responsive to the processing of safety. But we wanted to kind of know a little bit more about what this means, because safety signals are really interesting. They're, not only do they kind of reflect the absence of danger or threat, but they also have their own kind of effective properties that are important. They promote rest and relaxation, and to some extent it's been hypothesized that they might have positive affective qualities, and we actually confirmed that in this experiment, where people did find these safety signals to be more pleasant after this conditioning process. We also found that the degree to which a person found the stimulus to be more positive, they processed safety well, it actually correlated or was associated with the activity of this brain region. So really interesting kind of, there's two sides to the coin here, when we're thinking about the brain systems involved in processing threats and safety. I just want to highlight another study. This goes back a few years, quite a complicated study, but it's really, really interesting and kind of brings together some of these ideas. In this study, it's actually what's called like a social anxiety type experiment, where they told people as they were in the scanner that they may or may not have to give a speech. And they were going to be given a certain amount of time to prepare it, and then they'd need to deliver it. But not everybody would get this. And then they imaged people across these sort of 3 periods: before the instruction, after the instruction, where people who were told they were going to have to give a speech naturally became anxious. You can see on the top right the small little square there with a sort of squiggly line. That's actually the overall increase in arousal that was characterized across this group. Everybody got anxious to a certain degree. And then they also scanned after that. But the point I think I want to make here is that the degree to which a person experienced anxiety, both physiologically in terms of the change of their heart rate, but also subjectively, was explained by the kind of the dual or opposing activity of these brain regions. And in a nutshell, the more that a person, the more that the ventromedial, this safety processing region, lit up, the less anxiety they seem to feel versus the activity of the cingulate region. Okay, so the point I think, or this study highlights that we really need to think about fear and anxiety in the brain in terms of very dynamic, very large scale interactions across these bigger brain systems, which appear to account better for how individuals vary in their experience of fear and anxiety, at least in an experimental sense. Okay. So let's now talk or focus on the evidence in anxiety disorders. Many of you be aware that anxiety disorders are among, if not the most common psychiatric diagnoses. In Australia, at least based on the data available, around 14% prevalence rate, 12-month prevalence rate. This is based on old data, but still probably very, very relevant. And that seems to be sustained. In terms of their higher rate of prevalence than some other disorders, that seems to be sustained across the age group shown on the top right-hand slide there. But it's interesting that, at least from a neuroscience kind of point of view, that the study of anxiety disorders really seems to lag behind other less prevalent conditions. And why is that? It may be that there is this general feeling or bias that they're seen as more treatable perhaps and less severe. But I don't think this is really reflected at all in, if we look at the clinical outcome data, where certainly recurrent illness would certainly be the rule, rather than the exception. So a lot more work needs to be done in this space. I did a little literature search just to sort of highlight this. This is through PubMed, where I've put in some terms like fMRI, brain imaging, tasks, schizophrenia, depression, or anxiety. And what comes back from that, just as a general search, is about 700 studies, experimental studies, for example, schizophrenia, about half that for depression and about half that again for anxiety. So definitely an understudied area. Now, not surprisingly, most of the research to date, has been strongly influenced by and focused on, or sort of searched for, this amygdala, story with regards to anxiety disorders. And there's a review published last year or the year before by Brooks and Stein that tried to attempt to put it all together. And they would sort of conclude that anxiety disorders are overall characterized by this heightened engagement of a broad brain fear network, but also that, these more regulatory parts of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, for example, would be somewhat underactive. So how does this sort of, if we look at individual studies, is this really the case? I think I want to say that it's very important to keep in mind that there's tremendous variability really across these studies, in a lot of ways, especially methodologically, and you've got to take that into account. It's almost, you could say, that there's really been very few studies that have actually been the same, really, across these different disorders. So a lot of studies would, that in terms of experimental approaches, a lot of focused on trying to provoke a person's symptoms when they're in the scanner, showing them, for example, images of kind of disorder-related themes, to try to provoke these threat responses. Others more at the other end of implicit processing of threats and emotions, using emotional face expressions. A lot of these studies, and of course studies as well that, which I'm going to focus on, of fear conditioning and fear extinction. And I'll talk about some of those next. Another thing to highlight is that the populations in these studies also vary quite a lot in terms of the characterization of the disorder, severity, the nature of the population, demographics, and really there have been very few, if any, cross-disorder comparisons. So the extent to which these disorders are characterized by common or distinct neurobiological changes is still pretty much, can only be inferred, but it hasn't been confirmed. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about, just quickly, I'll just summarize the fMRI studies of fear conditioning and extinction anxiety disorders. Most of these studies would use an experimental design like this, and actually quite difficult studies to have been conducted, because a lot of them sort of take place across 2 consecutive days, which is challenging, as you can imagine. So there would, involve a fear learning component, the acquisition of the fear. They would then extinguish that in another part of the experiment, and then on the second day look at how well that extinction memory is retained. There've been about more studies in post-traumatic stress disorder, about 7 to date, 3 studies in generalized anxiety disorder, and then single studies really for social anxiety, obsessive compulsive disorder, and panic disorder. So I'll try to go through some of these because the results are really interesting. So in PTSD, it's quite consistent evidence that this ventromedial prefrontal cortex component that processes safety doesn't really respond well in PTSD. In the top slide there, it's a bit hard for me to see, but this is a comparison of PTSD participants versus trauma-exposed non-PTSD participants, and they generally show a lack of this safety signal. That also seems to carry across to that second day of testing where people need to recall that safety memory. And instead they show kind of persistent response, in another part of the brain, the cingulate region, which appears to sort of be more related to the expression of the fear. So it's still there, in other words. They're not able to really get on top of it. And this finding's been confirmed in another study. It's quite interesting. Very, very similar results, different group and different population. We see a similar pattern actually emerge across OCD. There's only the one study, let's remember, to date. Just this year, another paper came out in social anxiety disorder, which I thought was interesting, which is more focused on performance or public speaking anxiety. But what they did was they were able to link the extent to which a person showed this deficient safety signal processing to their therapeutic response to, it was actually, I think, a single day intervention for public speaking anxiety, but it predicted how well people responded sort of 2 weeks later to that intervention. So some link there with a treatment outcome, but there's not enough of these sorts of studies. We've also been looking at generalised anxiety in some of our own work, which is still getting put together today, and we've found that there really is this lack of this safety, signal processing. They tend to generalise. The fear tends to be generalised across these different stimuli, and in this study, at least, it was quite strongly predictive of the severity of a person's worry. Okay, so this is something that we're following up on in our work. If we put it all together, even though there's not a lot of studies, I think it is still a compelling case that for some degree of common alteration across the anxiety disorders in terms of this fear regulation, safety processing effect. But let's also remember, as I said, there haven't been really any studies to compare these findings directly. We're not really sure how well they generalize beyond just these experiments of extinction to other types of fear regulation. We really don't know how well they predict clinical outcomes, even in response to treatments. There's only really been that one study, or just naturalistic outcomes over time. Just this work hasn't been done. And in a lot of these studies, a lot of the patients obviously were receiving active medications, for their disorder, and we know that a lot of these medications do affect, of course, the activity of these brain regions and systems, and so it's hard to kind of know exactly how much that has affected these results. We do need more studies in treatment free participants. Okay, all right, we better get going. So I just want to highlight one study now, which is sort of focused on the developmental aspects of fear learning in anxiety disorders. There's actually only one study that's really looked at this. This is from a few years ago. It was quite a complex study, but I think just to summarise, they did characterise a sort of a distinct effect in anxious youth versus adults compared to non-anxious people, which sort of said that there probably is a strong developmental influence or effect here that we need to understand. And they've said in the paper that changes in ventromedial prefrontal function from adolescence through adulthood could influence anxiety symptom trajectories, thus mediating the adult outcome of adolescent anxiety disorders, trying to make a link, between this developmental change and later anxiety. If I skip ahead, this, of course, probably comes as no surprise that there's an impact of development on anxiety disorders at a brain maturation level. Most anxiety disorders have a peak prevalence, of course, in the adolescent years, and adolescent anxiety is a strong predictor of adult anxiety and, of course, other mental health comorbidities. And so this has sort of raised the question, is this about poor fear regulation? Is something going on in this sort of period of brain development that makes an adolescent less able to control fear and anxiety? And what I'm showing here is sort of, these are very well-known images from the NIMH brain development study, which assessed a wide range of people over multiple time points to be able to map kind of the maturation of the brain from childhood to adulthood. And the point here is that these prefrontal brain systems do mature the last, and it is a period of really dynamic maturation that obviously is going to be relevant to many mental health conditions, particularly anxiety disorders, and it's actually being shown. It hasn't been studied a lot in anxiety, unfortunately, and perhaps more in preclinical studies. And I want to just highlight quickly some work that's been done in animal models, which sort of confirms this idea that adolescence is a period of sort of selective vulnerability for fear and anxiety processing. These are some pretty elegant studies actually that have shown that fear extinction is selectively sort of impaired in adolescence, and this has been linked to changes in the plasticity or activity of these parts of the brain, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Kind of leads to the prediction, which is, if fear extinction is sort of selectively impaired in adolescence, does this translate in a clinical sense to a poorer response to exposure therapies, which of course are kind of based on the principles of fear extinction. And there's some early evidence that this might be the case, very provisional. And what I'm showing on the bottom here is just sort of a reanalysis of CBT response, that sort of broke down these subgroups from pre-adolescent, adolescent, and adult. And even though it's very preliminary, there's some hint here that adolescents don't respond as well to CBT, maybe for these reasons. We need to know. So I think this is an interesting area that is very, it's early days, but needs to be considered seriously. That developmentally targeted interventions may improve adolescent fear extinction. This has been shown in animal models. This may carry over to clinical studies in humans. And I'll just highlight briefly that this is, again, animal model research. In one study, this is by G. Kim actually, who's based here in Melbourne at the Florey, she showed that intensive extinction training tended to reverse the deficits that they saw in their model, adolescent model, mouse model of anxiety. And also if you gave some medications as well during this period, for example, D-cycloserine is a cognitive enhancer that's been tested a fair bit in anxiety disorders, not so much in youth anxiety, but it also, at the preclinical level, tended to have an effect that restored, this deficit. There's some other research that's come out. It's quite complex. I'm not going to dig into it, but that's, suggests that's targeting context in particular. Context you can think about as kind of the set of circumstances that surround how we learn and respond to fears. But adolescents seem to be protected a little bit against the influence of context on fear learning, and maybe this is an avenue that should be explored. But I won't go into too much detail about that paper. Okay, so I'm just trying to finish up. If we step back and think again about this two systems approach, I think what it does is just encourage kind of, again, a separation of these ideas, which may open up new avenues for thinking about treatment interventions for anxiety disorders. It's absolutely clear that drug discovery and development that's been based on the classical view hasn't really succeeded, has failed, I guess you would say. And perhaps this is because the emphasis of this sort of development of new treatments, at least in terms of drugs is not, of course, not the only treatment of interest here, but maybe they were based on the sort of wrong model, and that's why things haven't worked out so well. And we know that drug companies have kind of stopped a lot of research in this space, so we need to think a little bit more broadly about ways to improve treatments for anxiety disorders. Maybe this is a good model. Ledoux, in his work, has tried to kind of give some suggestions about where this work might go. And I kind of like this idea that attempts to find more effective treatments for anxiety disorders might begin with differentially targeting one system while observing changes in another. And I won't go through in detail here, but he gives some suggestions in this paper, which is in the American Journal of Psychiatry. You could download and read about how that might work. But that is to sort of separate our thinking about them and targeting them. And this might vary, of course, for different individuals. Okay. I think neuroimaging and neuroscience, of course, is going to play an important role in how we improve our understanding of anxiety disorders and how we might better treat them, in the future. On the one hand, I think one value of imaging is to improve our models, our psychological models of fear and anxiety disorders with a stronger biological rationale. If we learn more about the brain mechanisms and processes behind some of the for example, behind the subjective experience of fear and anxiety, we can develop better models, to think about them and then potentially translate them. And this sort of leads on to the next part below, which is that work like neuroimaging might lead to also to brain-based or the characterization of brain-based targets for treatment interventions. For example, we might vary, CBT approaches might be varied to more specifically focus on, for example, what we think or how the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is processing safety, or the cingulate cortex is, processing or appraising autonomic threats. We might be able to develop new psychotherapeutic approaches or variants that try to target these processes more specifically, or other techniques that haven't really been tested a lot in anxiety disorders, such as neurostimulation techniques like transcranial magnetic stimulation, non-invasive stimulation techniques. This is a space that could develop. It's still very early days. And just lastly, there's a lot of work going on at the moment that is trying to use neuroimaging in very large populations of participants to try to profile or develop biological, profiling about how people might respond to different treatments. This is really interesting. It is early days, but the initial results seem promising, and seem to improve upon predictions based just on clinical, or cognitive features. So that is some, practical utility to imaging that might appear in the future with more testing. All right, so just to wrap up, here's just 4 summary points, and I think it's pretty clear now that what I've tried to suggest is that it's important that we distinguish between brain systems that are involved in these sort of fast, unconscious processes of threat versus the more conscious cognitive aspects of fear and anxiety. I would argue that anxiety disorders actually show, probably the strongest evidence for alterations of these cortical systems that we think are linked to the subjective components of fear and anxiety. Neuroscience definitely supports, that adolescence is a unique period for the development and treatment of anxiety disorders, but much, much more research is needed in this space. It's still really at the preclinical stage. A lot more work is needed. And again, I think more broadly, I would argue that much more neuroscience is needed to just better understand our anxiety disorders and how to treat them. It just seems like a logical thing that has to evolve over time. So I'll leave you with that, and happy to take questions.
Yep, thanks, Ken. Just move over a little bit. See if we both come on the screen. Yep, beautiful. Thanks for such a fascinating and informative talk. Really appreciate that. I think kind of what you've shown in the presentation is a large amount of the research has been done in healthy people and probably in animals as well, and it's only really started to move into clinical populations, and the findings are still seem quite preliminary. Like, you can't really summarise, in different disorders, even though you found some themes across disorders. It's still very early days.
Absolutely.
I think the other thing that sort of I took from the talk was how at the moment these models really don't account for those really individual differences, individual experiences, early childhood experiences, genetic factors, other factors that come into play that make things a little bit messy in clinical populations. We had a couple of questions around that specifically, so I just thought I'd ask a couple of the questions from the participants in the webinar. One was just around, I guess, the effects of substance use, given substance use is a common coping strategy in anxiety disorders. Is that taken into account in these studies that have been done so far as you know? And what effect do we know maybe it has on the fear response?
No, sure. I mean, at least in terms of the human studies, the human imaging studies and anxiety disorders, no, I would say no, absolutely it hasn't been taken into account. So, while a lot of the time these patterns would be measured and maybe reported, the actual influence on what we see in terms of the brain imaging results, no, it really hasn't been looked at in any great detail. So it's super important. I think often, maybe the way that researchers would try to get around this issue is to sort of match groups, in terms of the profiles of some of these other factors, so that they could say that, oh, we've sort of subtracted it out. That's not really a satisfactory kind of approach. Actually, we need to look at it because it's interesting in its own right. So,
Yeah.
No, it really hasn't been. I mean, just to get back to your original comment, it still really is early days, and there's a long way to go. And I think now also there's a shift. I don't want to get into it too much, but to think about not only anxiety disorders but a lot of conditions more dimensionally. So rather than sort of lumping and chopping one disorder and separating them like that, but actually look at more dimensional features. Like, for example, anxiety sensitivity is a great one. I think this may open up a new kind of, I didn't really go into it, but I think this will open up a new area of research in neuroscience of anxiety, and it may make it easier actually to look at some of these other factors that are really clearly important at the clinical level. To try to kind of unpack a little bit more what's going on.
Yeah, great. I've just realised I think we've got time for another question or two at the end, but I just wanted to show you a little bit of information that we do have some on-site workshops and consultation services available, and that you can go to our website to find out more about that. And I think we might have time for one or two more questions. So another question was around the role of genetics and epigenetics, and whether that's been looked at and how that interacts with the, I guess, anxiety or with the neuroimaging findings.
Yeah, it has. Yeah, actually, it has been looked at. It's quite a big area. I would say imaging genetics. It's constantly evolving. A lot of the earlier studies in anxiety were based on very small groups of participants. People are a little bit weary of these findings now. So, looking at, for example, a single gene polymorphism. There's some quite high-profile research papers, 10 years ago, showing that if you had this sort of polymorphism versus another, you're more likely to. But I think now the focus really is on huge cohort studies that are coming together around the globe. There's a lot of consortiums that are being put together, including some that Orygen here are very, very centrally involved in. And these are going to be more powerful to explore links between genes and brain and other clinical phenotypes. It's a very interesting space, and it basically involves data sharing around the globe. So there's a lot of work has been done, and a lot of work can be put together now to kind of ask new questions. So I think that, in terms of the genetic links to brain and anxiety, that will be probably addressed best in these sorts of studies.
Yeah, great. Let me just have a look.
What is PAG?
PAG, yeah, was that something you?
Yeah, it was probably in the
slide.
I didn't explain what that's a part of, a very small part of the brain. It's called the periaqueductal grey, which is very much linked to, kind of the expression of fear responses. It didn't seem necessary to really go into it today, but it's a very interesting structure, very small. We can pick it up with these sorts of imaging techniques to a certain degree, but it is a part of the broader picture of fear and anxiety system in the brain. That's very interesting.
And just, I think one final question, it was about real-world experiences. Yeah. What kind of real-world experiences promote safety signalling in the brain?
Yeah, well, maybe you can be asked another way, which is why do fear responses and threat responses generalise, across to other, essentially what are safe stimuli, and what are the boundaries there, and how do you intervene with people to kind of get them to be better aware of, or to be able to appraise the difference between a threat and safe. I think what does that mean? And so I think that's something that's really important. That's obviously a big area of research is the generalisation of fear. But real-world experiences that promote safety signalling. It's probably more just being able to really recognise when you are in a safe situation. And then, so I guess that is a part of CBT approaches. But perhaps it's something, at least the brain imaging data here would suggest that this is something that this distinction is really important. And
maybe it's broken, or it doesn't. People aren't able to recognise so easily when they're safe or unsafe, particularly if they've had early, traumatic experiences, or been, that then they're not able to differentiate what's safe and what's not safe, and that's
And
something
so,
you work
yeah,
on.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
you know, that's it. Coaching and intervention around that.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be really, really important.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that, Ben. I think we'll just move just to the end now. And I think I'd said earlier this was our penultimate discussion or talk on anxiety disorders today, but that was actually our last session on anxiety in the series. And next we'll be having a series of webinars on physical and sexual health and their relationship to mental health. And again, they'll be free and you can register for those online on our webpage. So thank you very much to Ben for giving such a wonderful presentation today and for everyone's attendance. We hope that you found the information valuable. And as I said, it will be available online. We will send you an email when that's ready because we have recorded the session today. You'll also receive a certificate of participation and a short evaluation, and we'd really appreciate your feedback so we can always keep improving our webinars for the future.